Hello and welcome back to Cosy Rosie Crochet. I am so excited that you're joining me today to find out more about yarn, yarn fibres, yarn properties, and I could go on, and I will. But let me introduce myself first. In case we haven't met, my name is Fiona and I am the designer behind Cosy Rosie UK. My crochet channel, Cosy Rosie Crochet, is an opportunity for you to find fun, free patterns to make, as well as teaching more crochet techniques, and now a whole series all about yarn. I am so excited to get this series finally underway. Yarn is a huge topic and I'm only going to be touching on some of the most common yarns in great detail, but I want to go through as much as I can and share my knowledge with you. I'm not claiming in any way to be an expert when it comes to yarn, but I am certainly passionate about it. Be it different fibre types, the characteristics about the fibres, how we can use them, how we can get the most out of them. This is what I want us to cover in this series, as well as going over some of the other ethical issues around yarn too. So today, what I want to go through in this video is what we're going to be talking about over the coming weeks when it comes to each individual fibre. And of course, I want to go through some of the basics with you today. So we're going to be covering what information you can find on a yarn band. We're going to talk about the different yarn weights that are available. And of course, we're going to talk about those main groupings of yarn fibres too. Each video in this series has its own article that supports all the information that's in the videos, along with giving you further links to different references so that you can do further reading on each of the subjects too. I should put a link here for you to go and check out today's article talking about yarn weights, along with how to read a yarn band, and you'll also find some information on the different categories that yarns are divided into with regards to their sourcing. We're going to go into that in more detail shortly, but before we do, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and of course the notification bell. I never want you to miss out on one of my videos, so if you do that, you'll be alerted as soon as a new one becomes available. Some of the topics that we're going to talk about over the coming weeks when it comes to yarn, which is quite a vast subject, are going to be the kind of following things here. I'm going to do a separate video for each of the yarn fibres, and I'm going to share different information about those yarns in those specific videos. And that's going to include information like the spinning techniques that are used to create the yarn. We're also going to talk about those yarn qualities and what those yarns are most traditionally used for, and some of the other applications that they can be used for. And most importantly, I'm going to talk about some of the ethical issues around some yarns too. We can't skirt around it. The yarn industry and yarn as a whole has a lot of ethical issues around it, and we need to talk about them and discuss them. The ethics behind yarn is obviously all down to personal preference, and I'm not here to try and change that at all, but it is something that we definitely need to discuss in more detail throughout this series. In this video, we're going to cover some of the absolute basics when it comes to yarn, and that's going to include the yarn weights. Now, you may be aware that each country has its own individual system for weighing yarn or determining the thickness of the yarn. If you're in the UK, like myself, you're probably used to terms such as DK or double knit, Aran, chunky, etc. And there are equivalents for those throughout the world. And in the US, a DK weight yarn is a size 3 or a light worsted yarn. Australia has another numbering system which is entirely different and can actually make more sense because they use the plies of yarn. So in Australia, an 8 ply is considered a DK weight yarn. So all yarns are made up of plies or strands of yarn, and the number of those determines the weight of that yarn. The plies themselves can be a different size, which can create bulkier weight yarns, but that's how yarn is weighed. It's all determined by the thickness of that yarn. There are a number of ways that you can check a yarn's weight. That is obviously by reading the yarn band. If you have that information band around the yarn, you can determine what that band says and kind of go by that. Alternatively, you can do something that's called wraps per inch. And that is literally where you wrap something around it and measure how many strands you have or how many wraps you have around that object in 1 inch. So yarn weight is more of a consideration when you are looking at making projects. So you might want to use a heavier weight yarn for something that's going to be warmer. So for instance, a bulky or a chunky weight yarn, they tend to be more traditionally used in colder weather projects or firmer projects. Now obviously the hook size that you use with the yarn weight determines more about the drape of that fabric. So how that fabric moves and the finished project, how it will turn out, is all determined by the hook size you use with whatever weight yarn you're using. The bigger the crochet hook or the smaller the yarn. So for instance, if For instance, if you used a DK weight yarn and a 5mm crochet hook, your fabric is going to have more drape than if you were to use a smaller hook, say a 3.5mm hook with a DK weight yarn. That smaller hook creates tighter stitches, and that of course makes the fabric firmer, so you get less drape. If you've ever looked at a crochet pattern and thought, what on earth is a worsted weight yarn in my country, or what on earth is a fingering weight yarn in America, then I have a really useful yarn conversion chart, and I'll pop a link here for you to go and download a copy of that chart so that you can have more information about the differences and use it almost as a conversion chart depending on what country you're in. We all access patterns across the world, and this can really help you determine which yarn size you need to use for your pattern. Something else I wanted to talk about or touch upon today is actually the information that is on our yarn bands. So I have, just because it's lying around, I have a ball of cotton here from Paintbox Yarns Simply Cotton. Well, no, it's Cotton DK, sorry. So already the name of the product tells me the size of the yarn. This is a DK weight cotton. Now, I know I'm a bit passionate about Love Crafts, but they very usefully put on the US sizing on here for us as well. So we know that it's a size 3. But there is so much more information that is available on your yarn bands. If you've got a ball of yarn near you, grab it now and let's see what information is on that ball. As you can see, this one has, it gives us a hook size or a needle size. Now obviously yarn companies don't assume that we're knitting, and they shouldn't. And they also shouldn't assume that we're crocheting. So you can see here it says 4mm, 6 USA, 8 UK. That doesn't mean, of course, that you have to use that size, but most definitely it's going to make the fabric turn out as the gauge tells us on the yarn ball. So this little kind of crisscross pattern that you've got in the middle of this yarn band is literally a recommended gauge. So if you were to knit up or crochet something, crochet a 4 inch by 4 inch square, you should have 22 stitches and 30 rows. Now it doesn't specify the stitch, but I can assure you the stitch here should be single crochet or just plain knit. And that's how you would measure your gauge. And then it gives you this really useful idea of how much yarn you're going to need to make a sweater. Now I have no idea why they do this, and it's not the number that's in the middle, because there are 50 grams in this ball of yarn and you don't need 40 of them to make a sweater. So if you're actually to use 600 grams of this yarn, that's only 12 balls of yarn. So I'm assuming the 40 is the chest size here. I don't know for sure. Also, some really useful information here is, of course, the washing instructions. Now, every yarn is different, and the way that you wash it and care for it is going to be different. I am going to touch upon that when we go through each of the different fibres, but obviously, regardless of which fibre or blend of fibres that you're using, go by the ball band when it comes to the information on how to wash it. If you're gifting something to someone that you've handmade for them, like a blanket or a sweater or a scarf, be sure to give them the instructions as well of how they can care for that handmade item, because they don't want to ruin it, especially when it's been made with love. The one final thing that I want to mention that's really, really important is the shade and lot numbers. So this lot number determines it's almost like a batch number. So if you have more than one skein or one ball of yarn in any one shade, if you're making a project that's going to use more than one ball, you need those lot numbers to match. If they don't match, there is a risk that in natural light, you will see the shade differences. The naked eye, when they're just sat next to each other, they might not look different at all. But when you stitch them up and stitch them together, my goodness, you would see any slight difference in those shade changes. If you can, try and secure the same lot number. I know that with Love Crafts, if you're placing a secondary order for some yarn, you can contact them to confirm or request the same lot number. With Warehouse, somewhere else that I purchased from a lot, you can actually see from the drop down what lot numbers they have in stock. So you can select from the same lot number if it is still in stock. So going into a little bit more information about yarn fibres themselves, I think it's really important to recognise that there are 3 main categories that all yarn will fall into, and it's all determined by the type of fibre that is used to create that yarn. So there are 3 main categories for yarn fibres, and they are animal fibres, plant fibres and man-made fibres. Within those, there are subcategories as well. Don't worry, I've made a chart for you. You can click the link to the article here and it will show you them a little bit more characterised or a little more categorised and broken into those subcategories as well. So let's start with some plant fibres. So the plant fibres themselves can then be subcategorised into 3 different categories as well. So you've got seed, bast and leaf. So some examples here to help you understand what type is what would be the cotton fibres that or the cotton yarn that we use. That comes from the seed of the cotton plant. You've got hemp that comes from the bast, which is the fibrous element of the plant. So maybe the bark or the stem. And then for the leaf element, a good example is the raffia. You can get like raffia tie, and you can actually crochet with raffia as well, which is a whole different thing. We'll come into that a little bit later in the series as well. So though within these 3 main categories, animal, man-made and plant, there are then subcategories within those as well. So with the plant, we've got those 3 subcategories. So with the animal fibres, there are 2 separate subcategories. And that is, of course, animal fur or animal hair. And then, of course, we have secretion under the fibres for animals as well. And obviously, there is only one animal that does secrete fibre that we use, and that is, of course, silk. We'll come back to that subject another day. Now, when we get into man-made fibres, there's 2 subcategories, and it's more to do with the processing of these man-made fibres because you might consider some of them natural. So the man-made fibres are then divided into different types of polymers, and there are 2 main categories of polymers, which is the string of fibre that's created effectively, and some of these polymers are natural. So for a great example, you know how passionate I am about bamboo. So bamboo is actually considered a man-made fibre. You can't spin the strand of bamboo. It needs to be processed, and therefore it becomes a man-made fibre. Other man-made natural fibres would be rayon or lyocell. I don't know how you say that, which features alongside cotton on occasion as well. Now the synthetic polymers you're going to be more familiar with, and actually I've got an awful lot of acrylic behind me. That is most definitely a man-made product. So you've got acrylic, you've got nylon, polyester, all these man-made fibres we're all very familiar with, and we use them in our yarn quite frequently as well. If you want to check out in more detail where some of your favourite yarn fibres come in on these categories, you can click the link in the description box to be taken through to the article that has the chart that shows you all these different kind of categories and subcategories as well. I would love to know if the bamboo being considered a man-made fibre is something that's come as a bit of a shock to you, or if that was something that you were already knowledgeable on. The final thing that I want to talk to you about today is, of course, the ethical side of yarn. Now, I know that not everyone even considers that they have an ethical standpoint when it comes to yarn. Some of us can't afford to have an ethical standpoint, and actually some of us don't know that we could have. The way that I want to give this information to you is on a factual basis. So kind of delivering both the pros and the cons when it comes to the ethics of yarn. Obviously that could be misconstrued to my own opinion, and some of it will be, I will be honest, but I will hold my hands up and say I appreciate that not everyone has the space to have ethical standards within their making. A really good example, without stumbling over my words too much, would be to consider that acrylic yarn is actually bad for the environment. You may or may not be aware that every time we wash an acrylic yarn, it releases microplastics into the water system. Now, obviously, I'm not saying in any way, shape or form that the yarn industry or us making a few crochet hats is going to have a massive impact on the microplastics in the world, because of course, when we're talking about acrylic and polyester and that kind of thing, these man-made fibres have certainly been around for a long time. But it's something we need to talk about, we need to cover it, and I am certainly going to be wholeheartedly giving you all the information I can about it so that you can make an informed choice as to whether you want to omit acrylic from your crafting, or if you're quite happy to use it as I am. All I'm doing here is giving you the opportunity to learn a little bit more about some of the environmental impacts, some of the environmental issues around yarn production, along with some of the fibre qualities that can impact on the environment as well. Just some facts that you can do with what you like. I also appreciate that in this day and age, some of us myself included, can't always afford to go for all of these natural fibres. Make sure, you know, to be double checking that we're sourcing our wool from hand reared sheep and that kind of thing. You know, for some of us, we just want to crochet, and, you know, if that's where you're at, that is absolutely fine. But you know what? I thought we'll have a little bit of a chat about it whilst we go over some of these issues at the same time, so that we can be more knowledgeable about the ethical side of yarn production too. Believe it or not, it's not just the yarn itself that can be causing some environmental issues. We also need to cover some of the yarn dyeing processes and the spinning process too. It's a minefield, but we're going to navigate it together so that we can all learn a little bit more about some of the ethical issues surrounding yarn. Ultimately, we're here for the yarn itself, and I don't want you to get hung up on the idea that I'm going to be giving you all the bad news, but I also want you to understand that I will be sharing that information. I want to make sure that I cover all bases when it comes to sharing this information with you. I am passionate about yarn, I'm passionate about crochet, but of course I would love to know what you want to know and what you want to learn too. So if you feel there's something that I'm going to already miss out on in this series, please do let me know. Perhaps there's a particular yarn fibre you want to make sure that I talk about or find an example of so I can review it for you. Again, drop it in the comments so I can find out a little bit more about what you want to know and kind of the things that you might already know or you want me not to go near. All of that is absolutely fine. As I said, this is going to be a series on my YouTube channel, Cosy Rosie Crochet, and you can subscribe to the actual playlist. Don't forget to go and head over to the article below so you can go and download your yarn conversion chart, so you can work in whichever yarn weight you want, whichever country you're in. And of course, you can find out more about those yarn fibres and the categories that they fall into as well. Thank you so much for joining me today. I cannot wait to share the next video with you, and it will be available for you really soon.